So, this is going to be a meaty one. I told Odette we need as much time as possible because what we've got on the panel is some really clever people. And they've all been doing really interesting things. And I'm going to give them as much time as possible to really dive deep and show us, who are at the chalk face on the ground, what they know about impact. Am I going to have to separate you?
I'm sorry.
It's fine, I'm joking. We're going to really, really go deep now. So if you're at home, make sure that you've got a cup of tea ready. Embrace yourself, this is going to be a big one. And before I do that, because this is one of those everybody's concentrating moments, I'm going to take a minute to thank Odette and Hannah. Yeah. I need eye contact, dear.
Sorry, I was just finding this.
All of this is because of Odette and Hannah. All of the goodness, all of the calmness, all of the being here togetherness is because of what Odette and Hannah make possible. Otherwise, I'd still be in my living room talking to the walls. So thank you, my darlings, thank you. Okay. Okay, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to be curious, we're going to be generous, and we're going to be reflective. I am going to ask our, I wanted to say contestants. I'm going to ask our panelists to explain who they are first, what their story is, and how they got to be sitting on this very high and uncomfortable stool today. And then we're going to dive deep into exploring what their expertise tells us as tutors. And I'm going to start on the left. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Thanks, Laura. Go
thank
ahead.
you. So I'm Laura Fox, and I work for the Education Development Trust. So our primary role is providing the training for tutors and mentors who are in schools as part of the National Tutoring Programme. So we're a pillar of the National Tutoring Programme. So myself, my colleague Ruth, and a team of education advisors essentially dig into the research, and I'm really trying to investigate what makes a good tutor and really provide the training to support our colleagues to become the best tutors they can be to support the students in school. I guess for a little bit of context, prior to that, I am a teacher of, well, was a teacher of about 18 years and was in school throughout the pandemic and left just shortly after. But I was in a leadership role and had those conversations about the impact of the pandemic on some of our pupils, and obviously knowing how powerful tutoring could be. And then I joined EDT in 2001 as part of the National Tutoring Programme team. So I guess I've sort of try and see it from both sides, from that position of the teacher in the school wanting to do the best for their pupil, knowing that there's some tutoring that might be able to happen outside of school or in school for that pupil. And now I'm looking at it with a slightly different lens of how can we best support then those tutors doing that vital work in the training that we provide them.
That's lovely. That really strikes me that you've seen both sides of that dialogue. That's really.
I've been a tutor as well.
Joe, I should have warned you. I'm not going in a straight line. Christy, go ahead.
I was sitting here very comfortably thinking I'm going to be the last in line to go next. So hi everyone, I'm Christy. I work at Impact Ed. We are a social enterprise that works with both schools and education organizations, so both sides of the spectrum, to help them evaluate the impact of their programs, interventions or products. And historically, we started off doing that work only with schools, but over the last few years, we started working with education organizations as well. And that's sort of the part of our organization and the work that I oversee. And that covers sort of organizations across the third, private, public sectors, and also includes a number of tutoring organizations as well. A couple of charities like Coach Bride, Talent Ed, Equal Education, Get Further, that work across sort of different parts of the education space. We work with EDT as well to evaluate the school at tutoring arm of the NTP, and are doing a couple of sort of other projects in this space more widely too.
Yes, we do want to know.
Do you want to know what?
Where you started?
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, so personally, so I've been at Impact Ed for about almost 3 years now, but I started off working in the education space as a tutor, actually, in Singapore, quite a different context. If anybody's interested in that, we can talk about that later. But after that, moved into the research and evaluation space, and that's sort of where I've been building my experience over the last few years and bringing together in my current role, especially.
Fantastic, thank you. Go on, Joe.
Do I need a mic? I don't have.
You've got one.
I've got one. Of course I have.
I know that. They're really comfortable.
So the first thing
I didn't get one.
I am not a tutor. I've never been a tutor. I'm really curious about learning from your expertise.
Awesome.
But I have been a teacher, a primary school teacher, dipped in and out in various ways. I still teach a day a week. And during the pandemic, I was half the time in a school, which with a decent telescope, you can probably see over there somewhere in Poplar, and saw kind of a bit of tutoring in the first year of the NTP firsthand, which I might talk about later. I now, for the last 2 years, have run an organisation called the Centre for Education and Youth. We're a think and action tank based doing work across England on a range of issues. In terms of tutoring, we were a learning partner evaluating a number of tutoring programs, particularly with action tutoring and third space learning. Then we moved into a piece of investigative work just at the height of the kind of worry about where the NTP was going, and we did a report last year which had some recommendations on how you embed, improve and transform tutoring. I'm still curious about more investigative work, a couple of lines of inquiry I'd really like to learn more about and think more about with you. But we're also an action tank, and we are beginning to think about what we could do in the more practical space, particularly around supporting 14 to 19-year-olds, and those struggling, both to be tutored and to become tutors.
Yes, we love that. Which takes me perfectly to Anne.
Excellent.
Love what we did there.
Fantastic. So yeah, Anne Morris, and I'm founder and CEO of the bizarrely named Yippee app. I'll come to that in a second. So a little bit about my journey. So I was a maths teacher, so a former maths teacher at secondary level, and I left to go into accountancy and then started a family, but then wanting to come back into the world of work when the kids were of an age. I was not expecting to become a tutor or anything like that. I'd never set myself up as a tutor. But when you've been a maths teacher, you can't get away from, and you have kids, you can't get away from it. You are always, can you just spend a little time with so-and-so or so-and-so? So I'd always kind of helped friends in that sort of way, just because I could. I enjoyed keeping my hand in, really. But then one day on the news, I saw an article about adult numeracy standards in the UK, and it was just at that time in my career where lack of career because I was a stay-at-home mum, but just at that point where I thought, I've got a bit of time, I can do something about this. And so just thought about how I could help improve those math standards, and this is where the sort of fledgling idea for Yippee app came from, because I was thinking, who could help and how could we help? And so my idea, having been a teacher, was what I would have liked when I was teaching in the classroom, teaching a class of 20 plus students maths, where often very low ability, low confidence. I would have liked an extra pair of hands in that classroom. And so what I did was went away and thought about a model that would work for that. And what I came up with was this idea of relatable peer mentors delivering support to students in the classroom alongside experienced teachers. And so that's where the idea of Yippee app came from, and Yippee app stands for Young Inspiring People, Inspiring Young Aspiring People.
That is a name.
So the way it works, I won't do the whole model, but just basically, so you have a flavour. So we recruit and employ school leavers, 18 and 19-year-olds. They tend to stay with us for a gap year, for a full gap year, where they will work for a full academic year with the schools that they're working with. And throughout that time, it's brilliant because they can relate to the students in a very different way, so it very much complements what's going on in school and all the other support that's going on. But what we really love as well is that the tutors themselves benefit so much from that year as young people going into the world of work, or the transferable skills they gain. I'll stop talking.
And what do you call them?
Yes, and so about 3 or 4 years in, schools started asking us, we've got a maths Yippee app, could we have an English Yippee app? And we're kind of, that's quite cool. So we thought, we'd start calling them Yippee apps, and in their contracts, they are contracted as Yippee apps. So, throughout our branding, they are Yippee apps. So they are tutors, but they have a little spin on it.
So the rest of us here are Ippy apps.
No, we're all Yippee apps.
Okay. Haviva, will you go ahead, please?
Sure. My name is Haviva Kohl. I currently lead or co-lead all of Google's global apprenticeship programs.
I've been there for almost a decade now, and so I've worn a lot of different hats at Google, focused primarily on post-secondary students and supporting them as they're entering the workforce. But I started my career as an inner-city school teacher in the South Bronx in New York City. I'm a die-hard New Yorker. I can tell you stories of being in the trenches. And then I left to build schools in the emerging markets. I built a handful of schools in sub-Saharan Africa. Came back and realized that change happened at the policy level, so went and studied public policy. Worked for Mayor Bloomberg in New York City doing education policy. Then led an organization called Teachers Without Borders. We thought we would be the first, this was pre-Facebook days, where we thought we would connect the world's 64 million teachers together on a platform to exchange ideas and make connections and build really strong community. That's for another day and an interesting story. And then left to run a women and girls organization called Strong Women, Strong Girls, really focused on generational mentoring and supporting third through fifth graders, college women, and then professional women, and really make those connections. But I think more importantly why I'm sitting here is I am a mother of 3 little girls, and we have tutors coming in and out of the house, and I have learned a tremendous amount, and that is where I'm going to share a lot of my experiences.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Liberty.
Hi, Liberty. I suppose, talk about journey while I'm here. Yeah. So I started in the classroom. So I was a secondary school English teacher. And in addition to that, I also tutored a child sort of in my local area on a weekly basis as well. So I have some exposure to tutoring myself. But I think similarly to yourself, realised that policy was where the change would happen. So then sort of left the classroom, went to study international education policy, and then came back and started working at the Education Endowment Foundation. For those who don't know what the EEF is, they generate research and synthesize research on what works to improve outcomes for students, specifically what works to improve outcomes for disadvantaged students. But when I started at the EEF, the pandemic sort of came into effect, and so my role there was designing and setting up the National Tutoring Programme, and running that in the first year. So I worked with 32 different tutoring organisations on the NTP, some of which have been mentioned, Talent Ed, Coach Bright, and Third Space Learning. And then have since moved on from the EF and now work at a boutique education consultancy. We've worked with sort of supporting education group on their tutoring strategy, worked on the investment into targeted provision from Agathos Management to try and help them reach more students. Targeted provision work with local authorities to support students that are excluded from the mainstream education system. So whether they are out of school for mental health reasons or because they're in the care system and are moving between schools, between placements. So targeted provision kind of support that interim tutoring. So I've got a kind of relatively broad background when it comes to tutoring, so hopefully we can have a good discussion today.
I told you they were clever. Okay, so let's start with what makes good. What do we know about what makes good in closing the gap for disadvantaged learners? And probably, I should ask you before that, what the state of play is right now. So what the gap looks like, what the numbers are. Joe, do you want to kick us off?
What the gap looks like? I don't know if I've got the up-to-date numbers.
Okay.
I'm going to start with something a little bit more challenging, I think, which is not answering your question. I'll totally come to your question, which is, for all the efforts for tutoring to try to close the disadvantage gap through the National Tutoring Programme, the good bits, the less good bits, and where it is now, if you think about tutoring globally or in the UK as a set of interventions that happen all the way across, it probably widens the disadvantage gap rather than closes it. It's just where we are. The number of private tutors, the NTP, and schools not quite doing enough to address that gap. So if you think about it in the round, tutoring probably widens the disadvantage gap rather than closes it.
Tell us more.
Well, the fact that advantaged children and advantaged families access it in a certain way,
right,
and that the pedagogies of those people possibly get better and better, and the fact that the NTP almost feels like a sticking plaster in relation to that. So generally, generally, I'd say, and this is not the fault of any individual tutor or any individual tutoring organisation, people need to go where the market is. But essentially, we need to think about it in those terms. And then the challenge of making sure that that gap is addressed really becomes really quite,
Awesome.
significant.
You've earned your lunch. That was beautiful. Who would like to have a go at responding or taking it from there?
I don't.
Go on. You go first.
Everyone! Go on, Laura.
Incidentally, we've just you used to work at EDT, didn't you? So
I
we've
did.
got a kind of overlap there. I think you're absolutely right. And then, although it seems like quite a controversial statement, the sort of sticking plaster element, I think, is because in my opinion anyway, we potentially know, or we do know, how powerful tutoring is when done well. And I think pre-NTP, it was something that was accessed by those who were privileged enough, primarily, to access tutoring. And I think I read somewhere, and I'm not good at remembering where stats came from, but I promise it was a trusted source, that prior to about 2021, from 2016, private tuition had doubled, essentially.
That's the that's Sutton Trust report.
Yeah, no, thank you. And in that sense, absolutely, that's widening the gap, isn't it, that we've then found, and that we've now, the COVID pandemic has exacerbated, and we've now got to look at how we close that. But it's not going to be done in necessarily 2 years, is it? It's not going to be done in 3 years even. And I think that's a big part of the exciting conversation that we can now have, is what does that look like in the long term? If the sticking plasters like, well, the NTP or whatever we might be saying at the moment, what it's actually shown is that there is a massive potential there for it to become something that is embedded more in school systems, that is utilised, and the volume of research now coming out and the impact that we are now seeing shows that there's that potential there. So although the gap might have widened, might have closed slightly, or wherever that gap currently sits as a status quo, we know that there's something there that is worth keeping hold of and really going forward with.
Yeah. I think I just want to pull in here that we are not only talking about academic outcomes, we are talking about life outcomes. And it goes way beyond what exams can measure, and there are qualitative as well as quantitative elements to the research here. Go ahead, Christy.
Yeah, I think that's kind of tying in with what I was thinking about just now as well, which is with a lot of the work that we do, the evaluations we do, especially with the charities that we work with, we don't only look at outcomes in terms of attainment. A lot of them we look at social and emotional outcomes, so things like motivation, school engagement, obviously huge and important right now with the issues that we're seeing with attendance in schools and disengagement of pupils after and during COVID as well. And I think it's really exciting to see the organizations that we work with and some of the findings that we're seeing from the evaluations there, that there clearly is a link between tutoring and not just attainment, but also social and emotional outcomes and improving those. And sometimes the first step is just to get pupils motivated to learn, to get them to engage in school more widely, right? And we do definitely see that link there, which I think is really encouraging, and I think kind of chimes in with what you were saying, Laura, as well. And I think at the same time, we have to keep in mind the general picture of the pandemic and that having increased the gap between advantaged and disadvantaged pupils. And we did a really interesting piece of research called Lockdown Lessons during the pandemic as well, which showed that like well-being of pupils, particularly disadvantaged pupils, was affected. In general, it actually wasn't that affected, but then when you looked into the numbers and looked at the difference between those on pupil premium versus those that didn't, those that on pupil premium were actually affected more.
Fantastic. I think, let me just also add in how it overlaps with our conversations about barriers to learning, and how the interplay between advantage and barriers to learning and access to support are a key element here. Go ahead, Liberty.
Yeah, I think when it comes to obviously closing the gap, I mean, the EF research shows, and I think most people in here would agree, that the best way to improve outcomes for disadvantaged students is high quality classroom teaching. That is the sort of single biggest factor, having high quality teaching in the classroom. However, when we're thinking about extra support that students can have, tutoring, one-on-one and small group tutoring is then the sort of second biggest impact in terms of what additional support we can give into the high quality classroom teaching. And I think whilst the NTP, I know, has there's some controversy around it, and
Is there?
but putting all the kind of politics and the
That's right.
disagreements aside from the NTP, I think it's worked. What it has done and the kind of aims of it, and when we were designing it, was, I mean, first of all, was just to provide emergency tutoring to as many students as we could, and within sort of the first 8 months, there was over 200,000 students that received tutoring that potentially wouldn't have otherwise. So that was obviously a big win. But then I think the second thing that it's really bringing to the sector, and obviously Qualified Tutor does this as well, is bringing the kind of quality assurance side to the tutoring sector, which I think had been missing for a long time. And you sort of mentioned ad hoc earlier, and obviously it's not just any tutoring, it's high quality tutoring that is needed. And third, which I think is probably the most important, is creating this legacy in the system where tutoring can be complementary to the school sector and used as a viable pupil premium option, which I think is where it can kind of close the disadvantage gap. So I think for now schools see it as like a solid option for how to use their pupil premium funding to support the most disadvantaged students, which I think without the NTP perhaps it would have eventually got there potentially, but it's sort of, I think it's sped up that process somewhat.
We've been talking recently about how crisis has been enabling spurts of change. Yeah, we spoke yesterday with Yulia, who's been intervening and supporting students in Ukraine in a way that she wouldn't have been able to, except that the war happened there, and how those challenging moments, those sharp moments, create opportunities for us to accelerate progress. And I think that there's an understanding that there's a wholehearted commitment for tutors to be accepted in schools. I had a lovely chat with Stephen Fraser, who was running the EF at the time, and he used this lovely phrase that tutoring should become another instrument in the orchestra of school.
Yes, I remember
Yes?
that phrase. Yes.
Harmonious, aligned, comfortable, embracing, not challenging, but different. Yeah, not more teaching. And we were speaking earlier about how it does happen, it has been happening, that when schools are reallocating staff members into delivering NTP intervention, it can turn into more of the same. And really, we need it to be something additional and different. And that's certainly been an element here. Haviva, what do you have?
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about, so we have a rambunctious 6-year-old, and she's very, very, very bright, but we think she's dyslexic. And I have 3 different tutors working with her, but one of the tutors is a dyslexic expert, and she goes into her school. And my daughter doesn't love going to school except on Thursdays. And I've seen such a difference in how she shows up, how she engages, how she wants to make this tutor proud, how she's built the relationship with the tutor. Versus Sundays, where I have high school or students coming in and supporting her sitting down and doing her reading. She doesn't respond well to that, but that keeps me from having, heart palpitations. So I, assign others to support her. But I've been doing a lot of reflections on just the relationship that a tutor can build with a student. And if I think back to my own experience, so I'm dating myself, but 4 decades ago, I had this amazing tutor who was in his 70s. He was a retired teacher, and he taught me 2 things. 7 times 7 is 49, like the San Francisco 49ers. I'll never forget that, okay? My husband said no one will remember that, but that's the American football team. And the second lesson he taught me, or encouraged me to do, is try. So there were these newspaper entries that a student could send in a drawing or a story every Sunday, and then you'd get a T-shirt if you won. And I thought to myself, I was a poor writer as a young person. I'm never going to get this. And he encouraged me to try. And every time I had submitted, I got 2 awards. And I think to myself, I was 6 years old at the time, that relationship and that encouragement, I look back on my life thinking to myself, all these big, audacious, oh, that's impossible, I've always tried for because of that voice and that individual. And so I think about all these moments, and I think even as a teacher, in the South Bronx with different settings, with different really difficult students, I think to myself that one-on-one time, even before the academic and like closing the achievement gap, it was really around that confidence building and that boost of, you can do it. So that's how I think about that.
You said something that I have to ask. Attainment and advantage gap. So I chose to call the panel addressing the advantage gap, But I wonder what the overlap there is and what the choice would have been if we'd gone a different... How does the conversation change when we talk about attainment as opposed to advantage?
I didn't even notice that it was, I kind of just read it as the same thing, which is,
Are they the same thing?
I don't know. No.
Okay.
I don't know. I think, obviously, when we're talking about the attainment gap, we're usually talking about the difference in attainment between advantage and less advantaged peers. So I think potentially they are the same thing.
Laura,
It's
what
the
do you think?
semantics thing, I think.
Is it semantics? I'm not sure.
I'm not
Laura,
sure.
what do
I
you
was going to
think?
say I think there's a difference between attainment and opportunity. And
go on.
I think that I feel like I had an epiphany then when I was just sort of thinking that through.
I'm so glad I asked an impossible question then. Go ahead.
But I think when I think of advantage and disadvantage, although probably we do actually think of attainment, which I don't think is the right thing, I think opportunity is perhaps the better thing to try and think about, because as we've said about the motivation, the engagement, all of the other things that tutoring provides, that's far more. That's opening the doors to opportunities for them. If I can, just on you talking about your sort of personal experiences, I tutored my niece who is dyslexic, and I really loved the conversation previously about labels and barriers and etc. Because she was late identified as dyslexic, but that wasn't the barrier that she had. The barrier was the just pure confidence around the fact that she knew she was struggled a little bit more. And like Liberty, I was a secondary English teacher. So this time last year, I was actually tutoring my niece. And she did phenomenally well. And it is not due to my tutoring. It's due to just having somebody there going, what you've done is phenomenal. Be proud of that.
100%.
And it's not the grade that she got in English that actually has made a difference. It's the fact that she's now got a few more opportunities because she's a bit more confident about that ability. Yes, so it's possibly linked, but that she actually feels she can do it, and she's putting herself out there a little bit more. So I think, sorry, I've gone a long way around.
No, we're with you.
I feel like the opportunity and attainment are kind of possibly linked, but for me, the advantage gap is more about opportunities.
Beautiful.
Slightly driven by it.
Thank you so much. Let's move on to...
Hold on, Vicky. Can I just borrow your mic?
Just for clarity, Vicky has an awesome track record for piping up with exactly the right thing.
Although having spilt my mug of water over me this morning
Oh, Dolly.
about 10 minutes ago, can I just say I've not wet myself? Yes, no, just based on what you were just saying, I think there's one word which you said yesterday, which I may have put in my LinkedIn post, my first post ever. And
Look at the
Charlotte,
growth.
thank you for liking it. I like lots of others. The word is fair. I think it's about giving everyone, what we're aiming for is to give everyone the same opportunity. And I think that the fairness is in every single way. And I think what this community has done really, really well is integrate all the different links between the child and everything else. And I think that way we are creating, as much as we can, a fair playing field. But I definitely think that the finance, which I can't believe, I know why I tutor, that I love children, but obviously I get paid. Of course I get paid, otherwise I couldn't actually do it. So it's kind of made me really think about that and how that would be possible. But yeah, I just thought fairness was a key point from yesterday.
Thank you. Equity and equality. Yeah. Anne.
Can I just commit? So, I mean, Yippee App was in existence we started in 2012, so we were going a long time before the NTP. And one of the reasons that I wanted to deliver through schools was because partly my background in teaching, as I say, I felt like I appreciated what teachers would want and having that sense of help and support in the classroom. But the other thing that was a real driver for me was the fact that you could see as a tutor that people could afford to pay, but other people couldn't afford to pay. So it was really great to be able to sort of go into that environment where you could help those people, those young people whose parents couldn't afford tuition outside of school. So a really big driver about it was this idea of we can help those people who can't get help any other way. And I suppose reflecting on what Joe was saying about the sticking plaster kind of element of the NTP. So having been around before that and sort of being on this crusade and campaign before any of that happened, is just really interesting. When the pandemic happened and the idea, my first thought wasn't, how's this going to play out in the future? My first thought was, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with all my tutors? The schools are closed and they can't get in and do it. We did everything face-to-face before the pandemic. So, there was a real sort of, we were one of those businesses that kind of thought, what was going to happen to us? Are we going to have to just shut up shop for however long? We didn't know. It was really uncertain. But I think the thing that kind of struck me playing through it and coming out of it is then the NTP was announced. We were going to have this big program. I thought, great, we're in the right position for it. But then I thought, where are all these tutors going to come from? Where are they going to come from? Because everybody that I knew that tutored outside of school hours. So there was not much going on in school hours. And so the vast majority of people, I guess, who were tutoring were people who were teachers, former teachers, and it was outside of their teaching time. That's certainly the way I'd done it when I was helping friends. You can't tutor children very easily during the school day because they're all in school. So it was kind of, where is this sort of big army of tutors going to come from that's going to suddenly be able to help all the schools in the country through the NTP? And sure enough, I think, there's been a real difficulty with access to that provision. It's not that those tutors don't exist, but just, expecting to create an industry immediately just because there's a need just was never going to work. So I think I would turn it on its head a little bit and say it's not so much a sticking plaster, although it may feel like that at the moment, and totally get where you're coming from. But I think it's just the start of a new industry which will then evolve and become something in its own right, where people choose to go into tutoring in schools because that need is there, the support is there, the recognition that tutors working with teachers in a holistic way to help support child is a really effective way to do that. And especially for those children whose parents either aren't able or aren't interested, sadly, in helping their children in that sort of way. I know it's horrible to think so, but that is the case often. Lots of young people have parents who either simply not interested, or perhaps just don't know how to organise tutoring. They don't have those stable lives where they can make those sorts of arrangements, and perhaps just need that extra help and support. So I think for me, it's very much the sort of the fledgling. If you were asked suddenly to, well, like we are with lots of industries, AI is going to take over, isn't it, in a sort of very meaningful way? But you suddenly start an industry. It's not going to happen. It takes time to evolve.
Can I just say one thing? So because I work in tech and so does my husband, we talk a lot about what is the future going to look like for our children. And it does keep me up at night, especially with artificial intelligence, and I think it will be hugely beneficial, but I think there'll be some challenges. I do think, for tutors, people often ask me, why do I have so many tutors for my one daughter, for example? And I think what I've learned is it's less about the curriculum or the content in which the kids are learning. It's more about the process on them problem solving, how to engage in a situation and actually articulate ideas. It's negotiating. And so I would say that's the one thing that I think about when I have these different individuals who go in and work with my 6-year-old. I hear her telling the 14-year-old, I'm not doing that, and I'm listening and I'm like, don't get involved. Let her, the 6-year-old and the 14-year-old, engage and sort that out. And to me, I'm like, that's a skill, because I don't know what it'll look like in the future with university, if they'll even have to go. But engaging in real life settings with the skills, I think, is something to think about.
We've been talking about life skills a great deal, and yesterday Dame Alison was talking about the back and forth and language and how important that is in terms of developing literacy and linguistics, but also the assertiveness and the clarity about what you want and need. I think there's a strong piece about implementation that we must look into now. And I think alongside that, there's a piece around demand and supply. I would like to suggest that there are tutors out there. They've just all been siloed. And that by bringing tutors together and giving them access to routes to support in the NTP, we're going to find that those implementation routes actually become much, much looser. So the EEF needed to create a structure because you needed to look at something that was robust and scalable. And now there has to be a process where we let more people in through different routes using various quality assurance and an understanding that there's lots of different versions of good. So let me just tell you one story before I hand back over to implementation. We have a small tutor business who has been a member of our community for a very long time. And when they launched, it was 2 people working together, and they did a lot of work on who their ideal client is. And they said, we teach 11 plus, and our ideal clients shop in Waitrose and drive a Land Rover. And as they said it, they cringed. And I think it's really important to know that although those children who eat Waitrose meals are absolutely eligible and need fair access to tutoring, there are so many different types of personas that need access to this training, to tutoring. And those tutors did not want to serve that persona, they just thought they had to. They thought that's where the market was. And so this conversation I find really, really interesting because people are opting into tutoring where they don't feel that they're just serving the most privileged to become more privileged. And they can actually be far more values-led in how they position their contribution in education. Joe, you've got tons to say here, hey?
We shouldn't set up an us and them thing here, right? If you're a child and you're falling behind, regardless of the income of your parents, you deserve support and motivation to get somewhere else. And what you're doing as a community of practice, you're doing incredible work, largely not entirely in that space, to really support them. And actually supporting schools at the same time. So I don't want to demean that at all. I also want to recognise the diversity of that market. I live in Hackney. Lots of different streets around me have little small tutoring companies serving all sorts of children and young people, particularly those from ethnic minorities who might be struggling at school. So it's not like rich and the others. There's a whole spectrum there.
That's right.
But at the same time, at a system level, we need to think about what the system does to particularly focus on the most disadvantaged. The Treasury would call anything else deadweight costs, which means, is the state paying for something that parents might pay for otherwise? And with the NTP, that is an issue because the rush and some implementations issues with the NTP is it's still not focused on the most disadvantaged. That's kind of what the data says.
Right.
The other thing I just want to say, I really love this phrase, orchestra. It strikes me that the orchestra of schools is still too uniform in terms of the orchestra being generally one teacher. Most of the time is one teacher, one TA, 30 kids.
It's not bendy enough.
You've got to break that, and I haven't seen schools that are really brave to break that at both sides, particularly with AI, things like Sensory Tech that can really support basic skills, adaptive assessment, all sorts of amazing things that can frankly do a better job than many teachers in terms of zones of proximal development, next questions. All that could be taken off them. So suddenly you could have a lot of time with kids in rooms of 60, 90 kids. And then... Oh, really? I'm sorry. And then that frees up space for some much more 1 to 3, 1 to 5, whether it's project-based learning, whether it's individual interventions and support. But somehow, at the system level, you have to not totally break it, but bust that model for the 1 to 30. Maybe it's like a few hours a day of your time rather than 6 hours a day of your time in that model.
Can she have a microphone? Give them... Why, so you can take it?
So it's so important what you're saying, because I think it was John? Yeah, it was John Nichols who was talking about this yesterday. Ever since you said, Liberty, about quality first teaching, I'm from a teaching background. I taught and led for 20 years. I was of that generation that first introduced, or rather the government introduced quality first. We did so much training on it. You now bring in this idea of changing the whole model, which again was discussed yesterday, and we're talking about this orchestra. So my question is, what does quality first teaching now look like? Because, when I was starting, I was that one teacher in a class of 30 with the one assistant, and we were working with that model of quality first teaching. And yet we're talking now about an orchestra, and it's more that, the onus was all on the teacher with quality first teaching before. So my question is, if that is still the priority and the number one thing that changes attainment and boosts attainment, what will quality first teaching look like in the future, and should it even be called quality first teaching?
That's right. Quality first education or quality first learning.
I'll attempt something on that.
Go ahead.
Well, it's not exactly answering your question, I don't think, but I think it's interesting, and obviously this is something we've looked at when we're compiling the training that tutors need. It's not the quality first teaching, but the skills that tutors need to be effective tutors. And it was really interesting reading, I think it was the Ofsted Phase 1 findings, when they're talking about the most powerful things that a tutor can have is an ability to explain well, for example. It's an ability to take a really difficult concept and put that across to pupils, to do assessment, instant assessment and feedback in an instant in the classroom to move that learning along. So I think the quality first teaching piece, although AI is obviously, and all of that side of things, and technology is going to be and should be much more significant. I think there's some fundamentals that the human will always have to deliver, and that in terms of quality first teaching, those skills of tutoring and teaching overlap so much that I think that research suggested that tutors with QTS were more effective, but that's because they've got the understanding of those really challenging, how to question effectively, and those are really.
Can I jump in? I think what we're saying about AI are exactly those things. The targeted, timely intervention is exactly what Century Tech delivers. What they don't deliver is relationship. What they don't deliver is warmth and spontaneity. What they don't do is go under the bed. Yeah? You didn't go under the bed. What they don't do is wait for the child to come out from under the bed, in order to engage. So there's a piece around going to where they are that maybe the tech or building a bridge towards learning that you need the human to do.
But I'm also really curious about how all of you as, innovators able to be really agile and fleet-footed are using EdTech to inform your work. It must be some really interesting blends going on. Similarly, I'm really interested in how tutors support parental engagement. So they don't replace parental engagement, but actually are there things you can do that actually support parental engagement when you leave the room for the week? And I'm sure there must be really interesting innovations you do and that are happening from the larger agencies in that.
So let's make use of our community of practice and ask those questions in the community and see what contributions come out, because there's some real expertise here and there, and it would be really, really useful to pull those ideas together. Go on, Kaylee.
Just going to put that there.
I think just listening to all the conversations that are going on, I think there's a really big overlook over some really talented people in early years. Because this is all about this is the foundation of the early years. It's about those questions, it's about facilitating the learning. It's about meeting the child where they are and pulling them up. It's not about, it is about teaching, obviously, but it's everything that's being said. I think this is where early years is being really overlooked. And actually in my company, I employ a lot of early years teachers for that reason. As soon as I see the early years teachers apply to be a tutor, I'm all over that.
You heard it there first.
Because that's the pedagogy that I want to support and to bring into education. And I think it comes from a government level that is very looked down upon still. There's still a stigma about being an early years teacher. And I feel that a lot of what we're saying can be addressed by either supporting those practitioners further or by bringing in an element of early years into pedagogy, into later teacher training. But that's just my opinion.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I do think I'd like to think, the early years is obviously, it's incredible. I think it is becoming more of a conversation, and I think the government have now clocked on to how incredibly important it is with things such as scaling up the Nuffield early language intervention across the country, and also sort of the Fair Start research that's going in with the Sutton Trust. So I think the recognition is starting to become there, and I think so. I just echo. I completely agree with you.
There's some elements about early years that we've spoken about lots of times about how it aligns with tutoring and with coaching and with mentoring and being the guide on the side. I wonder how it overlaps with the HLTAs that you've been training.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting, again, listening to the SEND conversation previously, because on our training, we found the majority of tutors or not yet at the point of tutoring, potentially, who come through our training are primary practitioners and they're HLTAs or TAs who are being, so when you talk about being creative with schools and with that orchestra, I think some schools are starting to realise the power perhaps that they've not seen before in HLTAs and TAs, and they're the ones coming through the training, and I think that's where there's a wider impact going on here, because this is a sector who are so valuable, who don't necessarily have a consistent approach to how they're deployed in schools. I remember when I first started the TA, I didn't know how to utilise that TA properly, and very often she was just checking, are you okay, are you okay? And that was kind of her role in the classroom.
And it's really difficult because you didn't sign up to manage adults, you signed up to manage children.
Yeah. And so many of the tutors and the practitioners from that kind of background that are coming through the training now are actually saying, well, this is what I needed.
Yeah.
So actually that one HLTA might do some one-to-one or small group tuition with some students within their setting, but actually their practice at any other point in the school is going to be so much more powerful because they've actually had some pedagogical training. And when I say pedagogical, I mean relationships and all of that. I don't just mean the academic content. So I think there's so many potential knock-on effects of actually what's been happening over the few years that it can't be, it's not, the controversy around the NTP is there, but there's so many unexpected benefits that have potentially come out of it, and areas of the teaching and tutoring sector that have really benefited from that focus. And sorry, just one more point. When you were talking about early years, I think that's particularly links back to the sticking plaster aspect, in that it's got to be sustainable, because the pupils in early years now were so impacted by those lockdowns and everything that they went through, that they're going to be in our education system for a long time, obviously, and they still are going to need this. We can't rip off the plaster and say, off you go.
I love that. I absolutely love
it's that.
Let's look into sustainable implementation. What do we know works and what can we roll out?
There was a question there.
I'm coming to you soon. Go ahead. I've got I've got to push the conversation forward, and we will come back to Q&A. Go ahead, Joe.
No, I was just saying, there's a question. But
Implementation, what do we know works and what will be sustainable in making sure that tutors remain a member of the orchestra?
Yeah, I can maybe start with that one and then hand over to anyone else. But from my side and from I guess Impact Ed side, there's some of the projects that we're working on at the moment, that implementation piece and some of the questions that I think you guys were basically going through just now as well is so interesting, because there's obviously evidence, or we know that there's evidence available that tutoring in general works, but if we dive into the more granular detail of what works in what settings, what context, there's a lot less evidence available. And we just started a project with 5 different tutoring providers where we wanted to look at sort of the variety of their implementation models and really understand like what has most impact in which particular contexts, and diving into the detail there. So things like group sizes, I think we've made a lot of reference here to like sort of one-on-one tutoring, but like what's the different impacts of 1 to 3? Is there a magic number? We've seen some evidence, but there's also some variety of evidence where for some subjects 1 to 3 actually works really well, and for others 1 to 1 actually works a lot better. And again, a lot of the research originally or so far has been done a lot in the English literacy space and less so with other subjects. Is there a difference between what works well for what subjects? And one that I found really interesting that our tutoring providers are really interested in too is like how tutoring is communicated to the pupil getting the tutoring. Like what's the framing, the language used around that? Because I don't know, I guess really bluntly, if you tell people you're doing badly, you need the support, like what kind of framing works well for a pupil to properly engage them in that tutoring as well. And there's different ways that different organizations or providers go about those. So early stages for our project, so I can't necessarily tell you exactly what the answers are there, but I think it's sort of the next step from what I see in terms of the research and the evidence that we need around what works in tutoring and digging into those more granular details.
They definitely seem like the right questions, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
And I think factoring in context
100%.
is really, really important. So I heard Dylan Williams speak this week, who is the educational lead in education research, and he said that he did a 6-year study with Joe Bowler. I mean, these are big names in education thinking, and they forgot to factor in all of their studies about class sizes, they forgot to factor in who the teacher was. And he said 6 years of studying turned out to be meaningless because he can't go back and find that out now. And so it's these mistakes so having regard for the context, I think, it makes it far more complex, but it's certainly going to make it informative for us. Aviva, did you have something to add?
No, I was just going to say context is everything in language. I know, my little one, she'll say, oh, I'm not a part of the SMART group, because they pull these kids out and they put them in groups. And I know that they use like colors to define the groups, but kids are perceptive.
Hedgehogs.
Yeah, they're very perceptive. And so even when I asked her to, like last night, I was telling her I was coming today, and she was like, oh, can I draw a picture about this and that? And I was like, well, why can't you write? No, I can't. I can't write. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So it's really interesting, the language and the distinction.
Yeah, if I can just come in there, because I think the language is really key. And before the NTP, when suddenly we were starting, it was very much a case that we were going to schools, and often the students would be really reluctant. Oh, do I have to go? And they've been targeted for extra support, and it was very much that sort of language. And they were reluctant because then they are being dragged down. It's very obvious that they're being sort of there's this focus of needing extra support. Whereas now I am finding that it is much more positive with the NTP, and that's sort of becoming more commonplace in schools, is that it's just my turn to go. It's my turn now, and so on. And just to come back to the sort of idea of the quality in teaching, that's a really, really interesting thing. So I work with this really unusual age group of, seemingly really pretty unqualified people. They've done A-levels, but they've not had any sort of teaching qualification or anything like that. It's always been successful because of the peer relationship, and that's the thing that we offer, which is different, but it only works in the context of that experience and the complementing what else is going on in schools. But I think what sets it apart, one of our colleges said to us what it really is for them is that they are experts at being students in the modern age. And that has really been, we were like, right, we'll write that down. Yeah. Because, it doesn't work in isolation. I'll be the first to admit that. The idea of one of our tutors going and teaching a class, absolutely not. But the fact that they can build trust really quickly, as any tutor can. I mean, this is not magic, but because they have that connection, they have been through COVID as students in this setting now, they really understand those student pressures. They have just done exams. They can react in a different way, which means that they can build trust really quickly. But I heard every excuse in the early days as to why it wouldn't work. They won't be patient enough. They won't be authoritative enough. They won't, how would they be able to, why would we take students out of working with a qualified teacher to come and work with an unqualified tutor? But it works.
And one of the things I found interesting about the near-peer relationship is that it tends to be that the tutors are the most academic in their class because they want to go back and do more. Yes. And the students who tend to be nominated for tutoring don't tend to be the most academic. And I have sometimes found in coaching those tutors that there's a lack of empathy that creates a little bit of, you have to sort of remind them to think about the things that they find hard.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? Juggling.
Just to pick up on that. It's really interesting because when we do work with those tutors who are A stars across the board at A-level, and they're super, super confident, they know this subject, they want to go and do medicine, whatever it is. You have to wind them back so far. They are talking about coefficients and this, and I know you're going to be working with...
And their brains are popping with all that knowledge, yeah.
Exactly. But I think from our point of view, we don't only recruit from that pool. We recruit from a really wide range. We take everybody on a case by case. So we would think nothing of it really, recruiting people who had C's, B's, A-level, they're absolutely, if they can connect, and often they've struggled in exactly the same way as, the students are struggling, we really like that because then they can land really easily, they get where the students are coming from, and then they can just take that from there.
And
so it's a wide range. Yeah.
Let's talk about implementation on this side.
I think the one point I was going to make on implementation is I think it's very crucial to take stock checks and like almost before before you start a block of tutoring or whatever it is that you're implementing, it's so important to have like review cycles on what's working and what's not working, and not just kind of waiting for something to go wrong. Actually pre-plan check-in points throughout the sort of however long the process is of which the intervention is that you're delivering.
Is there also an element of what's working best?
Yes, definitely. And I think it's very easy to kind of get not carried away, but sort of just keep going with what you're delivering because it's working well, but actually taking some time and sitting back and thinking what is working well and what could be working better, and should we do more of the stuff that's working well, and just acknowledging that means that you might focus on that a bit more if that's the things that are working well. So I think for implementation, for me, it's all about these kind of consistent review cycles that never stop until the implementation has finished.
And we know that headspace is at a premium. And we know that the reason why most of us stepped out of the classroom was to contribute by taking all of those things off our plate and finding a new plate so that we could contribute. Mm-hmm. So how do you create those learning loops when everybody's up to their eyeballs in implementation? Real question.
I think, again, it comes down to the planning side of it. So thinking, okay, so after 2 weeks, we'll kind of review 3 things, like 3 aspects of what we're looking at. And then after 4 weeks, we'll do the same thing again, and then being open to changing direction and being flexible on what you initially set out to do and what you think was going to be what you're delivering, and actually being open-minded that, okay, fine, if that's not working, we'll go in a different direction. But I think planning out those times where you're going to review it is so important, because otherwise it just always gets shoved down to the bottom of the priority list.
So there's a discipline there, but there's also an agility that comes with it.
Yeah.
And knowing where to be flexible and where to just stick with your plan so that you continue with the check-ins.
Exactly, and that happened on the year 1 of the NTP. We designed it in such a way, but then because the pandemic was an ever-evolving beast that we had to respond to, it meant that we had to change how the delivery looked. So initially it was designed for face-to-face tutoring, but then we went back into lockdown again. So then we had to adapt it to online, which meant we had to we had to go through a whole safeguarding process with online delivery in the home and with all of the tutoring organisations that we'd already approved. We had to go through kind of a second process, and we had to then be flexible on the amount of hours that each student would get. And again, the program changed within the 7 months that we delivered it in the first year, 7-8 months.
And you were stretching people's adaptability every time.
Yeah, but we had to take those constant check-ins to see what was and wasn't working.
Yeah. I have to hear from everyone. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the NTP is the world's biggest ever attempt to embed tutoring into a state school system. Yep. By some distance. There's bits going on in Holland, bits in the US, but it's just the biggest ever attempt. And they need some kind of applause for that, really, the government. They acted quickly, they weren't going to get everything right. When we think about it 6 years on, how can we make sure it does make a difference? Obviously, it will make a difference to those children and young people that are involved. But the most important difference I think it can make is to get a really much better, fine-grained understanding not whether it's made a difference, not proving impact, but understanding under what conditions does tutoring make the biggest impact.
Oh, lovely.
Now, that's a mixture of that big NFER report that we all can't wait to see, the work you're doing, the micro evaluations that you're talking about, and all of you. So ideally, in 4 or 5 years' time, whenever it is, we just know much more about, coming back to your question, what does quality first tutoring look like? What types of pedagogies work best under what conditions? And that will be, the mature market we need for this. Just one, go on.
Out of interest, though, coming back to what you said about quality first education. Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you think that's actually what it should be called across the board? Because it's so interlinked.
Say the phrase again, because it was missed.
Quality, I was asking, because so you talked about quality first teaching, quality first tutoring. Maybe it should come under this umbrella of, as we are now becoming so interlinked and intertwined and interconnected.
No, but isn't that lovely that you're able to ring a change for as we are now becoming so much more interlinked? Yeah. That's a fantastic thing to notice.
I like that.
It's really interesting, really interesting.
Exactly. Because people on social media can say, why have the difference between teacher and tutor having been both? And you could argue I'm not really a tutor with what I do. I actually just, not just, but am I actually purely an educator? And maybe that's the big question.
Lovely. Lovely. This is another panel, and you'll book it. So Charlotte's planning a new panel on the question of whether there is where there is a new term that embraces quality first teaching and quality first tutoring to become assistant. That's right, and assistant to talk about the quality first education or learning provision, including our lovely early yearsers and the coaches that work around them. Am I allowed to do Q&A right now? Give me clear instructions, boss. Okay, Lucy's been waiting. Lucy's fingers have actually gone numb. She's been.
Can you just hold on one
Pardon? No, it's fine.
Laura hasn't had a chance to talk. Whilst you're doing the mic, Laura, go ahead.
I was just going to, while you're passing
Please,
the mic,
yes,
just
good idea.
very quickly on that, because I think it links to the sustainability bit. I think what we're seeing is that tutoring in schools and outside of schools works. HLTLs have so much power as part of that, that the sustainable idea is about that integration, isn't it? It's about everybody working together, and rather it being tutors, schools, it's that united, and that's what makes it sustainable. But I think vital in this, really quickly, is that school leader understanding that and sharing that language and making it a part of their
I think a lot of work that has really motivated me is removing the stigma around tutoring. And that's, I think, I spoke to a school leader, Lucy spoke to a school leader recently who said, you do tutoring, I don't need tutoring. She said,
10 minutes.
Let me tell you why you're wrong. Go ahead.
So I just, it's been a fascinating discussion, thank you. So 22.6% of students are described as persistently absent from school, and it just strikes me that this conversation here is very much about how we reduce the advantage gap for students who can either physically attend school or attend a lesson online, because we work with, Kaylee as well, we work with students who they would just close a laptop if they were given an online learning, and I just listening to how this is going to be funded going forward, all I've really heard about is extra funding from the government that would continue, and also pupil premium funding. And realistically, when schools have got huge teacher retention crises, like energy bills going through the roof, and physically maintaining a safe school environment, which we've seen in the news recently, it strikes me that no one's actually creatively looking at how we're going to fund this in the future. So I was just interested to know, in your organisations, what you're looking at in terms of creatively funding this going forward, rather than just keeping going back to the government for an extra handout, and that worries me.
It's a juicy question. Does anybody in the group want to contribute? Because it's a really, really juicy question about... Go ahead.
I think I was just trying to draw upon my memory of what happened in sort of the first year. I think when we were talking about those the adaptability of the year one of the NTP, initially, you're right, the approach was to go through schools, so the tutoring organisations had to create relationships with schools, but we actually adjusted the kind of delivery parameters of that so that virtual schools were included. So for those who don't know, virtual schools, they kind of are working with students. They are kind of part of a local authority, so they're not actually physical schools, but they are people, teams of people or one person that are in charge of, I don't like the phrase in charge of, but I don't know how else to describe it, of students that are in the care system.
Have responsibility.
So they have responsibility for, thank you. Students that are in the care system have responsibility for their educational outcomes. And the first year, and I'm not sure how it looks now, but the first year delivery was adjusted so that virtual school heads could get tutoring for students that are in the care system who are more likely to be persistently absent from school than other groups of children. So I think that's a flexibility, I suppose, not necessarily delivering it through the schools, but thinking about the whole system, particularly looking with local authorities, because they have teams of all local authorities have teams of people that are working with the most vulnerable students, and seeing and making sure that these programs can be commissioned by them as well, and not just by the schools.
Fantastic, thank you. Andrea, go ahead. What do the people say?
This is more my sort of thought, actually. I think Lucy's hit on something really interesting about we can talk about how we can make it sustainable, but if we have not got the funding behind it, it's not going to get out of the gates at the starting block. So one of the thoughts I had with the gap between those who are in, for example, independent education, private education, and there should, could there be more, because they're charitable trust status, a lot of these independent schools, can we have more partnerships where we've got financial support from independent schools as part of a social responsibility to give back in a way, and also perhaps within corporations for their part of their CSR. Why can't they invest more in supporting at scale, because it is at scale that we need it? Can we not be a little bit more agile with thinking, well, as Lucy said, the government aren't going to help. We need to find an open door that will. And we know that there's a huge sort of disparity between extreme wealth and the rest of us. We need to tap into that. We need to try and find people who perhaps, and organisations that might want to offer that support in a way that sadly the government aren't. And it's just about, I think, being agile enough to move away from that.
You're talking about sort of corporate sponsorship of tutoring. It's really interesting. We're going to go to Kristy because she asked nicely, and then I'm going to wrap up.
There's a couple of things that come to mind sort of following the last few things that you guys just said, and something that you said earlier as well. And I think, first of all, I guess recognizing that particularly when you're referring to the issue with attendance and absence in schools, there's a whole host of, I think, players across the sector. There's so many charities that we work with that particularly focus on working with pupils at risk of exclusion or that have high rates of absenteeism as well. And I think a lot of that, which I think maybe there's a bit of overlap here, which I think you started touching on, is this mentor role as well of potentially a tutor, or separately, like with a lot of organizations we work with that particularly focus on mentoring and thinking about the disadvantage gap. There's a lot of evidence around how important role modeling is and mentoring in that sense for disadvantaged pupils who haven't seen somebody in their family go to university, and therefore being mentored or tutored, whatever sort of context you want to put it in, can be really powerful for them. So I guess keeping that link in mind, particularly when we're thinking about the disadvantage gap and the range of organizations that work in that field, even if it's slightly outside of tutoring, it's probably a lot to learn from each other. And just wanted to call that out there.
Awesome, thank you. I feel that these are the richest conversations I've been a part of in tutoring in the years that we've been doing this together. I feel that the overlaps and the depth of the different topics and themes and expertise coming together are beginning to really feel like professional development in action. I feel like it seems to me that we've sown seeds that will affect each of our practice in their own way. And whether that's policy making, whether it's running groups, whether it's tutoring online, whether it's parenting, or running the entire world with Google and all the very clever things, all of it comes together. We have teachers in the room, we have tutors in the room, we have parents in the room. Some of us are wearing all the hats at the same time. But this sense of blending the different names, but understanding that different intervention has to stay different. So there's a bendiness, there's a flexibility, there's a reimagining, there's a making space for doing things better, not just good enough, that we are all opting into. And that's a really, really interesting place for us to be. There's no boxiness in this conversation, and I think that's what I found most refreshing. There's a real sense of being willing to step out of our comfort zones for the sake of the young people who are in early years right now, to make sure that whatever we create is sustainable in the long term. Thank you so much for participating. It's been a real pleasure to hear your thoughts. Thank you. Lovely people at home, turn your screens off and go and have some lunch. Bye.